amid rapid geopolitical shifts taking place in the Middle East. Iran faces new regional and global dynamics. This reality creates various possible scenarios for shaping its foreign policy. What strategy will Iran pursue to secure its future role in the region? What lies ahead for Iranian-Western relations amid ongoing nuclear issues? Will Iran form new partnerships and alliances in the future?
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. On behalf of His Excellency Dr. Sultan Mohammed Naimi, Director General of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, we would like to welcome you all at this special morning. I'm Abdurrahman Al-Haddadi, Deputy Sector Director of Strategic Studies and Research and researcher in Iranian Affairs, and I'm honored to moderate today's session titled Emerging Middle East Geopolitics, Scenarios of Iranian Foreign Policy. To examine that critical topic, we are delighted to welcome our distinguished guest today, Dr. Mahmoud Sari Al-Qalam. Dr. Mahmoud Sari Al-Qalam is a non-resident fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, and also non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. He is an academic and researcher specializing in political economy and development. Also, he's well-known in writing about the US-Iranian relations and Iranian political culture. He holds a PhD and MA in international relations from the University of Southern California and has taught for more than 3 decades in Europe, Middle East, and the United States. Dr. Sari Al-Qalam served as member of the Global Agenda Council of the World Economic Forum between 2015 and 2018. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mahmoud Sari Al-Qalam. Dr. Mahmoud, we are having this conversation at a very critical juncture of the history of the Middle East and also the history of the Islamic Republic. Over the past, I would say, few months, we have seen a lot of regional developments starting from the 7th of October. And let's say that Iran is a regional country in the Middle East, and Iran has interest in the region as any other country. And one of the instruments of this regional policy is the so-called axis of resistance, or let's say the network of alliances. But as we know, that this instrument has been severely declined due to the developments that we all of us know. So how do you think Iran would define its regional policy amid that new reality?
Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be back here at this institute, and thank you so much to His Excellency Dr. Noemi. I'm so pleased that I've had another opportunity to visit the UAE and also this very distinguished institute. If I may address your question, I'd like to pose an inquiry that may help us understand where Iran is today. We can ask this question: how do revolutions change? And we can do a comparative analysis of China and the Soviet Union. There are 2 ways we can trace how the Chinese Revolution changed and the Soviet Revolution changed into Russian Federation. If we go back to the 1950s and the 1960s, China projected itself as the champion of the Third World. And Chairman Mao projected himself as someone and China as the epicenter of confronting capitalism and the Western world. But what happened in the 1960s, gradually the same leadership in China realized that if China were to develop if China were to become a relevant regional and potentially global power, China must industrialize. And the very same leadership in China that pioneered the Chinese Revolution, they reached out to the United States to normalize relations and began a process of revitalizing the Chinese economy and bringing China back into the global kind of center of power. In contrast, if we look at the Soviet Union did not change by its leadership. Problems and difficulties were compounded, and they neglected all the challenges that they faced, and all of a sudden, the Soviet Union collapsed. So we have two kinds of approaches about revolutions. One, change by leadership, which is symbolized by the Chinese example, and another by the Soviet Union, where crises and events determined the fate of a revolution. I think Iran is the second example. From what I know about Iranian history and Iranian political psychology, I think Iran will not change by choice. It will change by the turn of events and also by compounding crises. So having that kind of a dichotomy in regard to revolutions, where does Iran stand today? Iran has an inflation rate of about 40%. Since October 7th, 2023, Iranian currency has depreciated 32%. Iranian energy sector needs $200 billion of FDI. And the current budget deficit is about 3 times the national budget. So Iran is facing considerable economic pressures. The country, for example, needs 400 new commercial planes, and the infrastructure is decaying. So what will happen to Iran? I think we can develop 3 scenarios about Iran. What will Iran do with the turn of events, especially in the last 2 months? Iran's doctrine of deterrence, I think, has embarrassingly fizzled out in the last 2 months. And so Iran needs a new doctrine and strategy of deterrence. It needs to revise and renew its way of looking at the region. So I can think of 3 scenarios about where Iran stands today. The first scenario is a wake-up call. Will Iran set itself on a new course of thinking about its economy, about its status in the region? Will it recognize the urgency of its economy? Will it join the global economy? Will it reorient its foreign policy to the economic necessities of the country? Will it fully adopt IAEA guidelines and focus on producing electricity and move away from other elements of a nuclear program? I will attach a 10% to this scenario. I do not think developments over the last 2 months are going to signal a wake-up call in Iranian foreign policy or its political economy. Second scenario is that will Iran look into re-empowering itself? Will it seek alternatives to come back to the region, to pose itself as a regional military, security, and political power? I also attach a 10% to this because Iran does not have the resources. If you just study the last 10 days, the Biden administration enforced new sanctions on Iran. 140 entities and individuals in Asia were sanctioned. These are individuals and entities that are selling oil to Iran, ship to ship, in the Indian Ocean through so many different Asian countries. So Iran is facing tremendous financial difficulties. So I think, at least for the time being, Iran cannot re-empower itself at the regional level. And this is in the face of great economic difficulties in the country. So I also attach another 10%. That brings me to the third scenario, which I think has a better chance of emerging. Let me underline a critical presumption that I have about Iranian politics. Iranian polity will remain intact, as much as I can estimate and forecast. But the current Iranian leadership cannot change. Current Iranian leadership has been accustomed to a way of statecraft, and for them to change, it will be political suicide at this point in time. So I do not foresee any fundamental change in Iranian leadership. Aside from Iranian polity will remain intact, I believe, in the foreseeable future. The Trump presidency will focus on Abraham Accords. I think that's their number one priority. All other issues in the region will take a secondary position in the Trump administration. I think during the Trump administration, Iran will resort to kind of an introversion. Iran will be quiet. Iran will focus on its internal problems because of, not because it does not want to come back to the region, but because it doesn't have sufficient resources to return to the region. Iranian rhetoric will be boisterous and provocative as ever, but Iran needs 2 to 3 million barrels of oil per day in order to mitigate some of its outstanding economic problems. And I think, looking at Iranian political culture, I think Iran will adjust. Iran will adapt. It will navigate. It will vacillate. It will procrastinate. It will harvest confusion. It will buy time. And so the key question is, in the coming months with regard to Iran and the Trump administration, to what degree the new administration in Washington is willing to compromise on relieving economic sanctions on Iran. And I think that will be the key question. I have consistently believed over the years that Iran is not interested in developing nuclear weapons. I think Iran does understand going that route will isolate Iran to the point of becoming a second North Korea. So I don't think domestic conditions, economic paralysis, and the overall position of Iran and the polity will only make the nuclear program as a bargaining chip, as hedging, and as a deterrence capability. So I think I will attach some 80% to this last scenario. I think we will see Iran evolve, kind of retreat, focus on its economy, but its ambitions will remain intact.
We'll come to the Iranian-American relations in details, but since you have spoke about the let's say, the fall of deterrence, what would be the immediate, let's say, Iranian policy for, or let's say, regional policy after that decline? You've talked about the long term, these scenarios, but now, in the current momentum, how Iran would react to what is happening in Syria, in Lebanon, in Gaza?
Yeah, Turkey, Israel, and major Arab countries will set the agenda for the region, I think, for the time being. Mm-hmm. I think Iran will not be a major player in the coming year or so. For Iran to come back and play a major role in Syria and Lebanon and in other areas of the region, it will not only need financial resources, but it will also require Iran to have a different kind of a negotiation with the United States. This time around, and I think Trump people have indicated this to Iran already, that this is not going to be a negotiation exclusively on the nuclear issue. If you talk to people going back to the Obama administration and even Biden administration, they will privately tell you that they made a mistake over the last 10 years not to include Iran's regional role in the process of negotiations. I think this time around, the US will certainly pressure Iran into a different regional role. So I think that's going to be part of the negotiations. Actually, I think Iran is much more prepared to compromise on the nuclear issue. It will be a very difficult task for Iran to reorient itself at the regional level in terms of financial and weapons transfer to other countries, to proxies in the region. So I think what Iran will do, it will ultimately depend on the kind of negotiations that Iran will most likely start sometime in February with the new administration in the US.
So I can hear from your thoughts, Doctor, that perhaps there's a harsh US policy coming down the road. But when we examine the statements that comes out of President-elect Trump, and specifically maybe a few months ago he had a podcast and he was talking about his new policy about Iran, and he said the following, that all what I want from Iran is to not be a nuclear power. That's it. So even the moderator asked him, so even if they have a certain domestic policy that is not, let's say, in conformation with the US standards of human rights, he said, it's not my business. So it seems that, especially that he keeps talking about deals. Iran has become a synonym for deal when Trump talks about Iran. So are we going to see a confrontation policy or maybe a strategic understanding between Trump's administration and Iran?
Iran does not have much time to negotiate with the US. By the end of spring, early summer 2025, Iran will have to finalize its nuclear and regional positioning with the Trump administration. Because if any of the European countries are going to activate the snapback positioning of JCPOA, they need a few months for bureaucratic reasons. So they will probably begin sometime in June and July. So Iran is under time pressure, and I think the Trump team has already indicated to Iran that unlike the Obama and the Biden administrations, they're not going to take 2 years for negotiation. And because of the urgency, at least in the mindset of the Trump administration, to focus on the Abraham Accords, they want to get this issue out of the way so that they can focus on relieving the Gaza situation, bringing the Palestinian Authority to Hamas group in Gaza, having Arab countries play a major role in alleviating some of the outstanding humanitarian problems in the Palestinian territories. So those are the priorities of the Trump administration. And because Iran has kind of lost its leverage in the region, and because of its internal problems, I think Iran will be forced to, at least with ambiguous language, to finalize the regional issue, but with very specific guidelines to finalize its nuclear program. On your second point, as long as we have the current leadership in Iran, I cannot foresee a strategic understanding with the United States. I don't think that's in the foreseeable future because Normalization with the US is equal to a paradigm shift in Iranian polity and political leadership. Maybe in the future, maybe when there is succession in Iran, depending on the nature of dynamics in post-succession, there may be opportunities for an understanding between the two countries. But the other thing is that if I were to look at Iran, change in Iran, I would look at two signs. That will indicate to me that Iran is changing. The first sign I would look at is this: to what degree the leadership in Iran, and it really doesn't matter what kind of a leadership. It could be clerical, it could be military, it could be security, it could be the business sector, any leadership in Iran. And to me, it really doesn't matter the nature of that leadership. To what degree that leadership is going to assign economic development as the priority of the country. Whenever Iran reaches that point, that national security is the outcome of economic development, then Iran will begin to change. Then Iran will shift from 1950s China to 1980s China. Then that will be the China moment in Iranian revolutionary kind of evolution. The second sign that I would look at to kind of orient myself into a new thinking about what's happening with the nature of polity in Iran is that if Iran focuses on its national economic development, it must normalize relations with the United States. No country, no developing country in the world can prosper economically without a normal relationship with Washington. Now, that country may choose to have limited commercial, industrial, whatever relations with the US, but it must have a normal diplomatic relations with the United States. We can look at China. I think the classic example is Vietnam. In the last Davos in Switzerland, the Vietnamese premier was kind of the star of the whole conference in Davos. And this is what he said. He said there was a time in Vietnam when we realized that we're not going to get equal with history, that we were attacked by all our neighbors, by outside powers, but we had to focus on the development of the Vietnamese economy. Then they realized they have to become a member of WTO, they have to normalize relations with the United States, and then there began, the Vietnamese kind of flourishing economy. I think those two signs will be very critical to understand Iran. There is potential, but not at this point. But I do not see that at this point.
With all these difficulties with having, or let's say, not normalizing with the United States, but maybe some sort of understanding, what about the European countries? Can Iran has a good ties with Europe without the United States, or it's one package?
History has proven to us that relations with Europe cannot improve without some understanding, modus vivendi with the United States. Because the US plays such a pivotal role in the global financial system, economic system, rules-based global economy. And look, Iran has 5,000 sanctions imposed on it, individuals and institutions. As much as I can recall, sanctions on Iraq were removed 13 years after Saddam was removed from power. So that tells me it's going to take a long time for Iran to be able to adapt itself to the new realities in the region and also global economy. We'll have to see how the Trump presidency plays out. But if the presidency of Donald Trump is going to kind of reassert itself globally, then Iran will have a much more difficult time in order to pursue its kind of non-economic ambitions in the region. If the US focuses on the Abraham Accords, then Iran will have multiple difficulties in its pursuit. So that's why I think, as much as I can understand the psychology of the Iranian leadership, I think we're going to witness a period of introversion, Iran kind of turning inward, but that doesn't mean that they're going to solve their problems with the outside world. It's like Soviet Union 1980s. It's like China 1960s. And I will say a few words at the end, what I have in mind about the future of Iran, where Iran is headed in the next decade or so.
So since you have mentioned Russia and China, even in the most optimistic scenario, if Iran opted to harness its relations with the West, with the current structure of the economy that is heavily dependent on the economic partnerships with Russia and China, how easy for Iran to move from that structure of economy, the resistance economy, to a more integrated one with the West, without political cost from China or Russia?
Iran's relations with China is not very substantial. Chinese trade with the Arab world is about $330 billion. With Iran, it's somewhere around $15 to $20 billion. And it's basically barter economy, selling oil in return for commodities and machinery. So China can divert its attention from Iran if it has larger interests, particularly not only with the Arab world and Israel, but also with the United States. So I don't see Iranian-Chinese relations as very critical and pivotal. But Russia is very different. Russia doesn't have much of an economic relations with Iran. It's less than $2 billion. But Russian relationship with Iran is mostly on defense, on intelligence, and on kind of regional cooperation on defense security related issues. I think Russia looms large in the Iranian mindset, in the elite mindset, because there is some kind of an understanding that Russia will guarantee the future of the Iranian political system. I think that what makes the relationship very strategic. Europeans may be puzzled why Iran is so involved in Ukraine, why Iran would sell drones and missiles to Russia. Of course, one major reason is because they cost much less compared to Russian drones and missiles. But I think at the strategic level, Russian-Iranian relation will contribute to the continuity of the Iranian system, Iranian political system. You also need to understand that Iranian leadership has this perception. It may be wrong, but the perception is real. And that is that the US has this plan for regime change in Iran. Now, I know from my understanding at both bipartisan level in the US that the US has abandoned that idea a long time ago. The United States is not interested in regime change in Iran. The US is interested in some kind of an understanding with Iran on common interests. US is not interested in changing the polity, the constitution, the nature of the system. I think they have genuinely stated that this is something in the evolution of Iranian society. But it's still that kind of a threat perception is lively, is valid in the Iranian mindset. And one of the reasons why, despite historical grievances, Iran kind of turned to Moscow and to Russia is kind of secure its continuity in the future, given their threat perceptions, particularly from the U.S.
But Dr. Allow me just
Israel.
to add something here
Sure.
regarding the economic aspect between Russia and Iran. I think 2 years ago, maybe, Iran signed an MOU with Russia that Russia will invest $40 billion in the oil and gas
Right.
industry. Such investment is a life pipeline for Iran's major industry. So the relation seems bigger than what maybe you have just suggested.
But it hasn't been delivered. It hasn't been delivered. Russia is too busy with Ukraine, and what has happened instead, Russian relationship with China has expanded. Chinese-Russian trade before Ukraine was about $35 to $40 billion. Now it's over $280 billion. So, and there is not much that can be offered by Russia to Iran. Iranian whole infrastructure in industry, its commercial infrastructure is basically European. And going back to your earlier question, I think the business sector in Iran, even those kind of government state enterprises in Iran, are mostly interested in European-American kind of technology and infrastructure building. So both China and Russia have not been able to kind of integrate themselves with the Iranian economy. I think it's been mostly superficial. If Iran shifts in the future, now that could be 5 years, it could be 20 years, I think Iran will kind of revert back to its traditional Western economic commercial relations, because the mindset is Western and the mindset is modern, and Russian products, Russian commodities, Russian machinery does not have much acceptance in the Iranian economy. So, although they have signed the agreements, but not much has been delivered by Russia to Iran. So it's mostly a security relationship than an economic one. To my knowledge, I think Russia sells Iran some gasoline in return for Iran selling oil on behalf of Russia in the global oil market. That's what Iran is also suffering, a shortage of gasoline. So that's the only, I think, energy relationship between the two countries. Russia promised Iran to complete its railway from one of the northern cities on its way to Azerbaijan. That has not been completed. It's been waited out over the last 5 years now between the two countries. So I don't think it's a very thriving economic relationship. It's basically security.
Okay, so before I move to our audience to engage them, allow me just to throw my last question, which is about the connectivity projects and the transit economy, because recently Iran has talked a lot about having strong economic ties with the wider region through the connectivity projects. But how viable is these projects in light of the European and the American sanctions?
Yeah. Iran has to enter the global financial system, the global banking system, the SWIFT system, and that requires American endorsement. Iran has to sign the FATF rules. That has not been accomplished yet. So I think there is kind of a division on those issues, to what degree Iran is willing to accommodate these kinds of demands from both its neighbors and also Europeans and the United States. So those are, for the leadership, I think those are political issues. They're not financial issues. And there is this fear of sharing. There is this fear of opening up to the world. I've published an article in the Atlantic Council a few months ago, and I argued that after 1989, Iran has not been an ideological state. and I have expanded on that argument. I think the window dressing is ideological, and Iranians are very skilled in doing this. But I think deep down, we're really talking about clusters of political groups jockeying for political power. And you need to realize that politics in Iran is a zero-sum game. And so if one group comes to power, all the others have to leave, and vice versa. So it's not so much the ideology of confronting capitalism or the United States or Europe or the Western world. It's a fact, to my knowledge, that if this particular group abandons its approach of proxies, of anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism, then there are other prominent groups in Iran that can take over their place. So Iran is not a country that has been accustomed to building coalitions. So that's history. That's thousands of years of history in Iran. So my take would be that Iran is kind of, at this point in time, is unwilling to open up to the global financial and banking system because the US will pressure Iran to change its concept on the nuclear program and also its regional activities because this gives the group of leaders in Iran to remain in power, to kind of solidify their political base in the country. Now, that may change with succession. No one knows. There may be a number of scenarios, but to your particular question, if Iran wants to open up to the region financially, economically, commercially, more FDI in Iran, and I think there are many Arab countries, especially in your area, who are willing to invest in Iran, but as long as Iran does not have normal banking relations with the rest of the world, that's not going to be feasible. So there are political obstacles, there are institutional obstacles. Those need to be removed before other countries can kind of feel that Iran is a stable country politically and economically so that they can reach out and invest in it.
Which is the minimum standards for any foreign investment. We would like to thank you, Dr. Mahmoud, and also thank our active audience for their active participation today. And we are looking forward to welcome you all again at ECSSR. Thank you so much.
Thank you.